Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of the RevRx podcast. I'm so glad you're here, and I can't wait for you to meet our special guest today. I'm honored to have with me Professor Nancy Pearcey. She is such a fascinating individual, and she's going to talk to us today about something that I think is one of the biggest problems we have in America and in the American church today. It is toxic masculinity. But Nancy, thank you so much for being here, and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. I told you offline, you are my go-to resource for all things toxic masculinity. And we talked about how refreshing it is to have a female perspective on what this looks like and how the Bible outlines for us what masculinity is, but how we have a culture who has kind of hijacked that. We're going to talk about that in depth today as we go forward, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about you. Can you introduce yourself to our audience? Tell us a little bit about who you are, what you're doing these days, and then what led you to kind of address this elephant in the room, toxic masculinity, head on.
So I do teach at Houston Christian University,
Mhm.
which was Houston Baptist until recently, but we changed our name, Houston Christian. So what that means is I get to teach young people, both undergrad and graduates, apologetics. I teach in the apologetics department, so I get to teach people how to defend their faith all day, which is my dream job.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Equipping young people to answer the objections that they're going to encounter when they're out in the secular world, or even in their own families.
That's
They
right.
have non-believing family members. So my main goal is, my slogan for the class is, for every what, you need a why.
Yes.
For every bit of doctrine you learn, you need to know how to explain it and defend it to your non-Christian friends and family members.
Yeah.
So, and my books all of my books have something to do with apologetics. Even this one, The Toxic War on Masculinity, the goal is to help Christians understand where the secular culture is coming from. You can't really stand against a trend, a social trend, unless you know where it came from and how it developed. So my goal was to explain, how did the secular world get to the point where it actually considers masculinity toxic, and how can we respond as Christians?
So good. And for you guys that are watching this, here's a copy of The Toxic War on Masculinity. It is highlighted and underlined and referenced several times on my copy. Absolutely love it. You are a wealth of knowledge, and God has gifted you in some unique ways, Nancy. So thanks for sharing that with us and with the world. But today, I'd like to start off with some good news. One of the things that you mentioned in your book, and I think is really important and really fascinating. The culture tells us that masculinity is toxic, but studies indicate that there's actually a lot of positives when it comes to Christian men embracing biblical masculinity. Can you walk us through some of that research that you found?
Yes, I was so glad that I sort of stumbled on this research. I'm looking at, why does our secular culture call masculinity toxic?
Mm.
And suddenly I found the answer is a Christian view of masculinity. And it's not just, a preacher trying to rev us up. It's actual studies done by sociologists and psychologists. And of course, Christian men, if anything, are said to be exhibit A of toxic masculinity. I'll give you just one quote. I have a whole page of quotes, but the founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement, actually said, the concept of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. So that is what we're up against. But what happened is, the sociologists, the social scientists, were listening to this and saying, well, where's your evidence? You're making these accusations, but where's your data?
Yes.
And so the good thing about Christian men being targeted is they got studied. And so in my book, I quote about a dozen studies, and I was blown away.
Yeah.
I did not expect Christian men to come out so on top in terms of, having test out as the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers.
Right.
In fact, let me give you some of the stats to back that up. So they test out as the most loving to their wives. And by the way, this is the wives speaking. I always get asked that. Yes, the wives are interviewed separately.
Yeah, who did they ask?
Exactly. So this is actually the wives reporting the highest level of happiness. Evangelical fathers spend more time with their children, 3.5 hours more per week, than secular men. Evangelical couples have the lowest rate of divorce, 35% lower than secular couples. And then, contrary to the media narrative, they actually have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America. Sometimes a quote can help crystallize it. So let me give you a quote from the best-known marriage sociologist in this area is Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia. And to give you a sense of his stature, he gets published in places like the New York Times. So this is actually from a New York Times article. And he said, direct quote, "It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of women who hold conservative gender values and attend church regularly with their husbands have high-quality marriages."
Wow. How about that?
Yes, exactly. And it's solid research. This is empirical data. So it's something you can confidently bring both into the churches and into the public square as well.
Well, in the world where I am, it's this overlapping of faith and science. And I love it when science, empirical data, backs up what the Bible says. It's almost like God knew what he was doing, right? When he describes for us how we should act as men, and we'll get into some of this, but it's almost like he knew us. It's almost like he made us and created us and knows how we ought to be.
Almost like there was a design there, right?
Right.
And that when we live according to that design, even science shows that, I forgot the one stat. The stat was also interviewing the men, and they also report being happier than secular men.
Yeah.
So they have better marriages, better families when they follow God's design.
Exactly. Now, you mentioned in your book that there are basically two competing scripts for masculinity. Can you walk us through those, kind of what those look like, some characteristics of both of those, and how they play out in the American man?
Yeah, this was very interesting. It was done by a sociologist. Again, we're getting the science. Not a Christian, but he's so well known that he speaks all around the world. And so he came up with a very clever experiment where he would ask young men two questions. First, he would ask, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man, what does that mean? All around the world, even countries that had no Christian background, men had no trouble answering that question. They would immediately start listing things like honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, look out for the little guy, and be generous, be responsible. And the sociologist would ask them, well, where'd you get that? And they would say, I don't know, it's just in the air we breathe. Or as Christians, we would say, they're made in God's image. And so even cultures that don't have a Christian background, it was fascinating. They knew exactly what it meant to use their masculine strength for good, not just to get what they want. But then he would ask a follow-up question. The sociologist, he would say, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young men themselves would say, no, that's very different. That means be tough, never show weakness, be competitive, play to win, and get rich, get laid, using their language. And this non-Christian sociologist said, look what's happening to our young men. On the one hand, they have an innate knowledge of what it means to be a good man, to use their masculine strength that God gives them for good, to support, provide for those they love. But they're feeling cultural pressure at the same time to be the real man, as they put it, which is not all bad. I mean, we want people to hang tough in a crisis. But if it does get separated from a moral vision, then it can slide into misogyny and entitlement and dominance, basically the Andrew Tate phenomenon. So that's what our young men in particular, are up against. They are feeling the tension between these two opposing sets of expectations. And that's why it's so important that we very explicitly tell them what it means to have a biblical view of masculinity. Let me give you one quick story. A graduate student of mine who's now teaching, she's teaching high school. She wrote me an email and she said, all my male students are fans of Andrew Tate. They're even using Andrew Tate quotes in the yearbook. I said, where do you teach? At a classical Christian school. So that really hit home. I thought, if we're not giving young men an aspirational biblical understanding of masculinity, they're going to reach out for these secular scripts. And we have to realize that it's not just that they're going to have nothing. It's not biblical or nothing. It's biblical or Andrew Tate. And so that's why we need to get in there quickly and help them to be very biblical in the understanding.
That helps us really put words to I think what a lot of men and young men are facing. And I'm probably on the generation that's kind of coming out of that. And I'm trying to help men a little bit younger than me be able to face some of this pressure. So you've given us words by looking at these studies and by putting those into place for us to describe some of the things that we feel. A lot of men, we feel that tension, but we may not understand where that comes from. And so that's really helpful and meaningful. Now, is this where that term toxic masculinity begins to come from? When does that begin to get introduced, and kind of how do we view that aspect?
Yes, well, most people think, and I did when I started this, I thought maybe 60s and 60s, second wave feminism. But when I started studying it, it turns out it started much, much earlier. It starts with the Industrial Revolution. Because before that, husbands and wives are working side by side all day on the family farm, the family business, the family industry. The children are working alongside them as well. And so the cultural expectations on men tended to focus much more on their caretaking role because they're with people they love all day. And even secular historians, one of them puts it this way. He said the concept of masculine virtue was, quote, duty to God and man. I thought that was cool that even a secular historian picks that up. So where did we lose that concept of masculine virtue? Well, the Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. And of course, men had to follow the work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time in American history, they were not working with family members, people they loved, had a moral bond with. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And that's a very different work environment. And that's when the literature starts to change. This was so surprising to me. Already in the 19th century, you see people starting to complain that men were losing their caretaking ethos, that they were becoming individualistic and self-centered and greedy and acquisitive, to use 19th century language, and that they were turning their work into an idol, that they were getting their main fulfillment and identity from work instead of from family and church. So the language, some of the language of the day was just as hostile as what we see today. And that's why it's important to understand where it came from. It came from an era where men got separated from their families, which kind of gives you the solution. We need to reconnect men to their wives and children, in spite of the fact that we still live in an industrial age.
Well, and before I think your work was probably the first realization I had that, wow, that was a light bulb moment for me. It's when we took work out of the home and off the homestead, and men were removed from the family. Okay, well, now raising the kids becomes the mother's job. The young boys are at home with mom, and then dad's in this kind of cutthroat dog industrial world, and they're absent from the home. And when they do come home, a lot of times they're still consumed with this desire for success and this desire for success outside of the home. And we just kind of start to see that as a slippery slope, don't we?
We need to go back and read the 19th century because we're so used to fathers being out of the home that we don't realize how traumatic they saw it at the time. At the time, you find historians and others saying things like, 19th century writer said, the greatest source of domestic sorrow today is paternal neglect. And you think, wait, the father's still technically in the home. It's not like today where we have a lot of fatherless homes. But because he was gone all day. This was a huge change. One of the most influential women of the 19th century was the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And she said, God is our father, and yet the prototype of the divine is out of the home now, from weekend to weekend.
Wow.
And so at the time, people really felt the loss, of the father's presence in the home. And it's helpful for us because, everyone takes whatever our current situation is sort of, for granted. Isn't this just the norm? So it's helpful for us to realize, no, fathers used to be much more involved with their families.
Yeah. It hasn't always been this way.
It has not. And it gives you freedom to sort of think critically of, well, can we maybe recover that in some ways? Can we tweak the workplace even today to allow fathers to have more time with their families?
And that's important. And I work outside the home, and I guess you feel like it's always been the way that it is now. It's kind of this recency bias that I think a lot of us have. But when you realize that was kind of the impetus behind some of these remarks and maybe the family becoming what it is, and the absence of the man from the home isn't a big deal. All right, so should be simple, right? We just insert the men back into the home. Unfortunately, we're still, a lot of men are still working outside of the home. One of the ways forward, though, that you try that again, that you present is kind of investing into your sons. It doesn't mean, you're home 24/7, because let's face it, what's a realistic plan moving forward for us as men today? We're probably not going to be stay-at-home dads, most of us. What is it that we can do? Well, investing in our kids can take a different form, can't it? We may not can go back to the good old days where we worked the homestead and our boys are alongside us and we're plowing the field and we're doing all of these things as we have done in the 19th century. But moving forward, I think there is still a place for investing deeply in our sons' lives. Can you share with us a little bit about what that may look like in our current world today?
Yes, of course, writing on the subject, you have to have some solutions. And so it's mostly anecdotal, but I gave a lot of stories of men who found ways to adjust the workplace. I mean, some of them went to the lengths of actually quitting their jobs and having a consultant job that gave them more freedom. Some of them just left work early, a couple days a week, to coach their sons' basketball and football teams. Some of them started home businesses. I have a couple of examples of men that you just wouldn't expect. A jewelry maker, for example, the things that you might not expect. Yeah. He quit his job and started having a home-based business where he provided custom jewelry to different companies. Yeah. And actually, this was fascinating to me. This is not in the book because it came out after the book. Mm-hmm. But Harvard University did a study on the pandemic. And it was reported in the New York Times, which also kind of surprised me, because the title was, during the pandemic, 68% of fathers said they got closer to their children, and they don't want to lose that. Wow. So the pandemic helped some people rethink, having their kids maybe doing home schooling maybe during that time. And some fathers worked remotely during that time. Yeah. One of my graduate students, her husband came home during the pandemic. He's an IT professional. And so I interviewed him and he said the transition was seamless with all of the technology now. And because I was home more, I decided I would be the parent who makes lunch. Because I was home more, I could be involved with my kids' schooling, talk to them about what they're learning. Because I was home more, I could take the kids to soccer practice. And he said, I'm never going back to 40 hours in a cubicle. And then the cool part was he added, the time that I used to spend commuting to work, I now spend praying with my wife. Wow. So I tried to give people inspirational stories of how they might be able to work even within the modern workplace. Yeah. Can we tweak it? Can we have some remote work, some hybrid work? There are ways that fathers can do that. And CEOs are more open to it now. I also had to go and interview the CEOs, right? They've got to be on board. So I'll give you one quote. It was a CEO at Zillow, I think. Zillow, the real estate, whatever it's called. Mm-hmm. At any rate, he said we were always hesitant, about remote work. We thought people would slack off, of course. And then he says, this is the direct quote, during the pandemic, our fears were completely exploded. Wow. We were not seeing any drop in productivity. So there's studies now showing that having home-based work, or at least part of the time, hybrid maybe, just so that fathers can be more involved with their children, they end up being better workers. Yeah. Because they're more motivated. They're happier with their family life, and so that makes them better workers.
Absolutely. I worked remotely during COVID and then for about 5 years after that, up until recently. And it was some of the best years of my life. Just really being able to connect on a lot of different levels. You miss so much being outside of the home. And of course I miss that now that things have kind of changed for our situation. But every move I've made in my career, I have made towards a work-life balance, towards improving a work-life balance. When I first started my career in pharmacy, I was working 14-hour days. Yes. I was working every other weekend. I gave that up for a job where I would only work every other Saturday, off on Sundays. That was important for my faith. With that came a pay cut. Mm-hmm. Traded that in for a job where now I'm off on weekends altogether, and then I'm home by 5 o'clock most days. And that came with a pay cut. But you know what? You can't put a price on that investment that you're making into your family.
That was some of the other studies that I have in the book. Were studies of men who did take pay cuts, like you said, the daddy penalty. Yeah, they paid the daddy penalty, and when they were interviewed, they all said what you said just now. It was worth it.
Mhm.
The family relationships being stronger, was so much more fulfilling. Time magazine reported on a study where 70% of men, that's a pretty high number, said that they would trade a higher salary for more time with their family.
Yeah.
And a lot of times they can't say that at work because they feel like they're being accused of not being
Right.
committed enough.
Right. But
One
yeah,
of-
it's
One of my
priorities, right?
students, one of my students did experience that, by the way. All he did was leave work at 4 o'clock 2 days a week to coach his kids' sports team. And his boss told him he was coasting, but he did it anyway. And as his sons grew up, they said, "Hey, we want to be a dad like you," which is much better than any workplace awards.
Yeah. Well, we've all seen it. These ideas that you're replaceable at work, but you're never replaceable at home. The minute you're gone at work, they're going to be hiring someone to come behind you, and you're expendable. But your kids are watching, and that's something that motivates me. It scares me sometimes because I think a lot of times we just, we wonder if we're doing well, but they're watching us, and they're seeing what we prioritize. And if we're prioritizing the dollar at the end of the day over time with them, they see that and they realize that choice is being made, and they may not be able to put that into words. But I heard there's a sermon illustration I've heard time and time again of this little boy that asked. He says he has 50 cents and he wants to know how much of his dad's time that can buy because he's always leaving for money. And it just breaks my heart when I think about that. And there's no shame or judgment. That's not what we're after. But we're after men finding their fulfillment in the things that they were created to find their fulfillment in. That's really where I think human flourishing begins, is when we do things God's way.
And again, studies show that men do get a great sense of masculine fulfillment from being involved, engaged husbands and fathers. You see, the modern world tends to think, well, men get their fulfillment from work. That's just the assumption. And it is understated, it is underestimated how much of their masculine identity does come from their role in the family. I think it's the National Fatherhood Initiative. They do a lot of studies on this.
Yeah.
And they found that fathers, just as much as mothers, say that being a parent is important to their identity. They didn't expect that. They thought women would say it and men would not. But no, they were equal. Men also said that they got their sense of fulfillment and identity from their families. Yeah. So I think sometimes we have to stand against the cultural messages.
Yes.
That tell us, the real man is the one out there sacrificing his family to get ahead. This is how one person put it, in one of these studies. He said, in America, it's become okay for men to succeed in work and fail in their families. I thought, well, that's a statement of how the secular world does see it.
That's right. And I think most men of faith that I know, they feel that tension. Mm-hmm. They want to be good dads. They want to be present dads. They want to be dads who invest in their family. But we're dealing with these competing desires. We live in a world that very much shapes the pressures that come along with being a man and being a family. Now, you mentioned the way that society depicts men, and I wanted to that's a good segue. I want to talk about a little bit of what I call the Homer Simpson effect. There seems to be with society, whether it's intentional or not, and I'll let you talk about that, this description and this depiction of dads as like just incompetent idiots. Dads are just sitting around drinking beer all day and don't really know what's going on. And I think Homer Simpson kind of sums that up for us, particularly for us in my generation. Grew up maybe watching the show or seeing some of that. But where did that come from? And, where does that take us as a society?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because I was thinking we need to cover this. Yeah. Because again, part of the culture that discourages men from becoming fathers is these negative stereotypes that are in the media, in movies, in advertisements. The father's always the bumbling idiot, the butt of the joke. Homer Simpson, Married with Children. My son loved the Berenstain Bears. Yeah. Did you ever read those?
Yep.
Because, well, there's more than 50 books now, but the first, the father was always the idiot, he was he was more childish than the children. So where did that start? Again, in the 19th century, when men started leaving home to work in factories and offices, for the first time, men were not in touch with their children. What's happening with them throughout the day? What are they thinking? What are they feeling? What are their experiences? And so fathers in particular, began to be described as superfluous, incompetent, and unnecessary and irrelevant. That's when it started. Yeah. I was shocked again to see how early it started, 19th century already. men would, well, if you're not there and if you really don't know the family dynamics very well, you come in and sort of, like an elephant in the, in the, what's it called, in the jewelry shop? Just China shop.
Bull in the China shop.
The bull. Sorry, my analogies are getting mixed up.
Mixed metaphors.
But yes, so they would come home and they wouldn't be that familiar with what's going on in the family. And so it was so sad to me to see the negative stereotypes of fatherhood go all the way back there. And again, what's the solution? The solution is for fathers to reconnect with their children so they are familiar with what their children are experiencing and thinking. The importance of fathers really came out. Sorry, I forgot to bring water. We can cut this, right?
Yeah, we can. You're good.
Sorry, I knew I should have brought water. The importance of fathers really came out in a study that I describe in my book. It was a 35-year longitudinal study. It fills the whole book.
Yeah.
The description of the study is the whole book that came out, and it won several awards because it was such a great study. And it was on how parents succeed in passing on their spiritual and religious commitments to their children. Studied it for 35 years and came up with two surprising results. The first result was fathers matter more than mothers. Mothers have an impact too, but if a father's a committed Christian, his children are more likely to follow him. They have the charts and graphs, and so you can see, okay, mother come up to here, but fathers come up to here. But then the second finding was it also depends on the quality of the relationship, because the father can be, a pillar of the church, a moral exemplar, perfect theology. But if his children perceive him as cold and authoritarian, then they will not follow him. Wow. They will not follow him in his faith. So that was the result of 35 years of study that men do have. Fathers will influence whether they want to or not. I think that's important for men to realize.
100%.
And then secondly, the quality of the relationship actually makes a difference.
And that's a huge study. For those that may not be familiar with scientific research, we don't do many studies that are longitudinally 35 years. That's really, really valuable information.
Let me give you a follow-up study, by the way. This was a smaller one, but it was done by on secular grounds, secular researchers. And they wanted to look at something a little bit narrower, but still important, which was, how do you raise masculine boys, masculine sons? And they found something very similar. They found that it does not matter how stereotypically masculine the father is, whether he's the John Wayne stereotype or whether he's gentler. The masculinity of the father does not matter. What matters is the quality of the relationship.
Wow.
If it's a warm, loving, supportive relationship, then the son will come out with a healthy, strong concept of masculinity. Yeah. So I thought that was an interesting, from a secular perspective, that they found something very similar.
Yeah, that relationship matters more than we know. I think it's kind of what we're saying here. And, even today, we have shows, we have movies that depict men as just these bumbling idiots that don't know anything that's going on in the home. We're just always like, oh, go ask your mother. One of my favorite comedians, he came out with an act recently, and he was basically depicting that same situation. That he didn't know anything at the home because he worked outside the home. And, it's sad because what we see and how we see things depicted in Hollywood and different places, it really shapes for us what we feel like are our expectations.
Yeah, I'm sorry when somebody makes it into a joke too, because it's not funny.
Right, it's not. You might laugh at that situation, but what's the bigger story here, right? Mm-hmm. The bigger story, and that's where you bring us hope, is that there are some practical steps we can take as fathers to be more involved with our children. That relationship, we've heard it time and time again in the 30 minutes we've been talking. That relationship with your kids is going to be one of the most important, if not the most important, calling on your life. I see a lot of dads today who, and I've been guilty of this in the past too. This isn't a preaching at people. It's possible to be there in the home and not be present. It's possible to be physically present but not really there. And we have such distractions that are available to us, such as things like this. That's a cell phone for you guys listening, that are tempting for us. And I can't help but think that those are tools that the enemy uses to keep men distracted from their most important job. And their most important job is to be the spiritual head of the household, to be the father to those kids, to be setting the example for the next generation, and to not let society define who you are, but to let God define who you are as a man.
And let me throw up a warning too, because the studies showed that there were actually two kinds of evangelical men. The first pushback I always get is, but haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of the culture? Well, it turned out that's not true of the men who are genuinely committed and attending church regularly. But the researchers went back to the data and separated out men who are just nominal Christians. My students don't know what nominal means, so I have to explain.
Let's talk about it. Yeah.
NOM is Latin for name, so it means in name only. So these are men who might identify as evangelical based on the family background and so on, but who attend church rarely, if at all. And they test out dramatically different. They actually, their wives report the lowest level of happiness with their marriage. They spend less time with their children even than secular men. They have the highest rate of divorce. They have, let me check my notes here. They have the highest rate of divorce, 20% higher than secular men.
Wow.
And then the real shocker is they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America.
That's unbelievable. Wow.
So the sociologist who did the largest study wrote an article for Christianity Today, and his conclusion was the most violent husbands, with the italicized, the most violent husbands in America are nominal evangelical Protestant men. So that's what the church is up against, in the sense that, how do we support and encourage the men who are doing well? Because that's what the studies show. The men who are committed Christians, as you put it earlier, the ones who are really trying to live out God's design, actually do test out as the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. And we should, by the way, encourage them, because they're just as discouraged as anyone else.
That's right. We all face the same struggle. Yeah.
And then how do we reach out to these nominal men who are identifying as evangelical, hanging around the fringes of the Christian world enough to pick up language like submission and headship, but who are infusing it with definitions from the secular culture. So that's why we need to understand the secular culture, because otherwise, we don't have a critical grid and we absorb what the secular culture is saying. And the church needs to have a way of encouraging the first group, the committed men, and then reaching out. How do you reach out and disciple these nominal men who you might say are ruining our reputation?
Well, that may be where the toxic part comes from.
Yes, exactly. By the way, I read only one study that gave actual numbers, because, you and I probably hang out mostly with fairly committed Christians. So I thought the nominals would be small. Well, it turns out nominal men and committed Christian men are about the same size. So if you meet someone who claims to be a Christian, there's about a 50-50 chance that he's a real Christian. I think young women need to know this, by the way.
I do too. Yeah, that's eye-opening. Especially I'm down here in the Bible Belt. You're probably included in that too. I can see that. It's eye-opening, but it's not all that shocking, because it becomes almost a country club of sorts. I'm going to be part of the church. I'm going to be Christian because I'm not Hindu. I'm not Buddhist. I'm not, fill in the blank. That's my family background, but the fruit's not there. And I shared with you a little bit about my personal story offline, and I won't share a lot of that here, but I've done that in some previous episodes. But, I think it comes down to our relationship with the Lord spills out into our relationship with everyone else. For a large part of my life, I was probably nominal Christian. I went to church. I was actively attending, but that was the extent of my Christianity. I did not know the relationship that was available to me. And I think that's where discipleship, like you said, really plays a key part. There's all sorts of people running around thinking that checking the boxes for Christianity is all that there is. And so by taking them deeper, by discipling them as a church, by finding these people and not saying, hey, who's a nominal Christian? Y'all come to Bible study with me. But you know what? Find your one more. Find someone in your sphere of influence that the Lord has put on your heart. I think that's the way forward. And Nancy, you have been so kind to us in this time together. You've given us all this information. I'd love for you to kind of pull it together this way. If there's a dad listening, what practical steps would you give him that he could take to be more involved with his kids today?
Well, let me start with one more study,
Hmm.
because this gives people hope and encouragement.
Yeah.
But it was done by a non-Christian anthropologist who did the first ever cross-cultural study of concepts of masculinity. And he found that, of course, there's vast differences between different cultures, but he found a common core of what it means to be a good man held by all these different cultures, even ones without a Christian background. And here's how he summarizes it. He calls it the 3 Ps, that the good man is the one who will provide, protect, and procreate. In other words, have kids.
Yeah.
I wish he'd said parent. That sounds better.
Yeah. Yeah.
Be a good parent. But provide, protect, procreate. And I thought that was, again, an encouraging sign that men are made in God's image.
Mm.
And we can be confident when we talk to men that they have that innate knowledge. There is something there that we can encourage and affirm, that they do know what it means to be a good man. They do know that their unique masculine strengths have a purpose, have a reason. Men need to have a sense of, indispensability.
Mm-hmm.
And they are indispensable in the family. So on a practical level, I would say I would stress especially sons, because with fathers out of the home, here's what historians tell us. When fathers left the home after the Industrial Revolution, at least girls had their mothers still in the home to give them a model of what it meant to be a woman.
Right.
But boys no longer had a model day in and day out of what it meant to be a man.
Yeah.
So it was actually more harmful to boys than to girls. One man, Robert Bly, who's considered the founder of the men's movement in the 20th century, you know him, he said the love unit most damaged by the Industrial Revolution was the father-son bond. And another a sociologist says, for the first time, American boys experienced an identity crisis. That term became popular in the 60s, but actually it started much earlier for boys.
Yeah, wow. And
another historian says, boys lost their connection to the adult world of men.
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden, everyone raising them was a woman. The mothers, the teachers, the Sunday school teachers, they often didn't have a male teacher until maybe their teens. So the answer is, I would especially like to see men, fathers, connect with their sons.
Yeah.
I think churches actually should have a ministry to fatherless boys.
Yeah.
40% of American children are now growing up apart from their natural father. 40%. It is the highest in the world, highest rate of single parenthood in the world.
Wow.
So the church needs to catch up with this and mentor fathers.
Yeah.
And maybe a special ministry to fatherless boys, because the studies have also found that father substitutes can have a big impact.
Yeah.
So church, youth group leaders, and teachers, or relatives like uncles, coaches, all of the, even neighbors can sometimes have a huge impact in helping fatherless boys. So that's encouraging. That means there's enough for all of us. There's enough for all of us to do to help especially young boys.
That's what came to mind for me, is that there's a job for all of us to do. If you have children and if you're a father, I want to encourage you to invest in those kids. That's the most important calling you have. And I want to tell you, you have what it takes. God has given you what you need. You're going to feel inadequate. We all do, but God's given you what it takes. If you're a mother, encourage your husband, your spouse. There's something for everybody. And I think together, we as the church can really help here. But Nancy, you are a joy and a treat, and you're a very gifted person. And I'm just privileged to be able to spend some time with you. Thank you for being here with us. I wanted to ask you, how can people connect with you and then be able to purchase a copy of this book?
Well, I do have a website. My publisher was very kind in redesigning it so it's colorful and nice. NancyPearcey.com. Nancy Pearcey is PERCEY.com. And of course, the books, you can browse all of my books there, which is nice, all in one spot. Read the endorsements and see what people said.
Yeah. Love Thy Body. I want to put a plug in for that. That's a good one. Yep.
So Love Thy Body deals with the cutting edge moral issues like abortion and homosexuality, transgenderism. So it's very much on the cutting edge as well. But of course, you can buy them all on Amazon or any of your favorite bookstores, christianbook.com. You can buy them anywhere.
And I'll add links to the show notes for all of those as well. But Nancy, thank you so much. I appreciate you and your voice and leaning into that. And I truly believe that this episode is going to impact somebody today for the good of the kingdom of God and for the good of some young boy out there who needs a father. So thank you so much for being our guest today on the RevRx podcast.
Thank you. And thanks for letting me be part of your ministry. I think ministry to men is perhaps the most important ministry these days. So
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Bless you.